Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another video, and today I'm going to be taking a look at some books from my collection which I feel are quite underrated overall. In the past I've done some lists where I've looked at some of my favourite DC omnibuses, Marvel omnibuses, or books featuring specific characters, but today I want to take a look at some books which I think overall don't get talked about very often, either because they're unpopular or maybe people just don't really think about them too much. But these are all books which I enjoyed, so whilst I'm not going to try and say that any of these are some of the best comics of all time, certainly not. In a lot of cases I can understand the criticisms that get thrown at them. But these are all books which I sort of unironically did get a decent amount of enjoyment out of, so I thought I'd do something a little bit different here and just showcase some books which don't really get much time in the spotlight for one reason or another. The first one, which I've got here, just creeping into frame, and I might lose some people with this one already. This is probably the most controversial one on the list. But this is the Heroes Reborn omnibus, the original epic, as they decided to call it on this second printing. Pretty bold claim. So this is, quite an infamous story. It's a huge omnibus, by the way. It's really probably one of the thickest ones in my collection. Bit of a monster, this book. But this was the whole thing from the late 90s where Marvel, in a good amount of financial trouble, decided to do something quite drastic and lease out a lot of their popular characters, Fantastic Four, Captain America, and Avengers, to Image Comics, and specifically to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld's studios. So for a year, these characters were all absent from the main Marvel universe, and they were in a separate pocket dimension, going through the events that take place in this book. Now, there's plenty to criticize about this era of comics, no doubt about that. It is not one of the all-time best storylines. Like I say, I'm not here to say that this book or any of the others I'm looking at is truly a masterpiece. Pretty far from it, especially in this case. But when I gave this book a chance for the first time, I basically went in with zero expectations because I'd never heard anything but bad stuff said about this run. And perhaps that was the big reason as to why I actually ended up quite liking it, because with such low expectations, there was really no way it could disappoint me. On these first few issues, we see artwork from Rob Liefeld, and I think that that in itself is certainly something that probably puts a lot of people off it, let's say. I'm not here to try and criticise Liefeld's artwork. I think everything that's been said about that has been said. Not much new I could add to that. But I will say that somehow I didn't hate it. And also, his artwork does not take up a huge amount of this book. There's plenty of other artists in here. Jim Lee is probably the highlight one. But there's some other good artwork as well by other artists. But it's just the story that surprisingly I found really interesting. It's by no means kind of a subtle, complex, story that's going to get you thinking about anything. It's not a deep story and anything like that. It's just quite a fun kind of action story with some fun stuff going on. It's a very 90s comic. If you like 90s comics in general, you probably could get some amount of enjoyment out of this. Certainly there's a lot of over-the-top artwork and things happening. A lot of the tropes from this era are all present here. But I quite liked seeing this sort of different version of these characters, because that's effectively what it all was. You know, it was a reimagining of a lot of these characters and their origins in a new world, kind of a fresh start. And it all ultimately built towards a pretty big, what I thought was quite an interesting conclusion. And I think that when you look at this book now, with the benefit of hindsight, with so long has passed since this came out, and you can view it as just a sort of isolated incident where, these characters all just spent a year away doing this stuff. It's an interesting period, an interesting kind of time capsule of a certain era of Marvel Comics that you can go back and take a look at when things were certainly very different to how they are nowadays. But yeah, this is a book that, like I say, I genuinely do enjoy. It's something that I can go back and have a read through and get a good amount of fun out of if I just want a story where I can basically switch my brain off, not think about anything too much. Heroes Reborn kind of does it for me in that sense. So I don't know. But, with that book, with any of the books that I talk about on here, definitely interested to hear what other people think. Am I alone in liking this? I mean, surely not. I can't be the only person in the world who likes these books. But we're going to stick with the 90s, and actually I've realised as I start looking through what I've piled up here, I've got quite a few 90s comics, which was not intentional, but that's kind of how it's worked out. Next up I'm going to look at Witchblade then, the original classic Witchblade series from the 90s, which most recently has been collected in these 3 volumes. I've got the hardcover volumes here. This collects the first sort of 50-ish issues of the classic series. I've looked at each of these books individually. In fact, I've looked at almost all these books individually, so I won't cover them in too much detail. But this is a fun series, which I think is another one where you can just kind of have a read through and just enjoy it without having to think too much about kind of what's going on. It's not a super thought-provoking series by any means, and again, it's been from the 90s, like Heroes Reborn. It's got a lot of those similar kind of tropes. The art style is quite similar, although in this first volume, you get, the majority of the artwork in here is by the late, great Michael Turner, whose artwork I always enjoyed, and certainly he was a talent that was lost far too soon. But I just quite like Witchblade. There was more to this than I expected. It's one of those books where I think the sort of, quote-unquote cheesecake factor to the artwork is maybe the most well-known aspect to it, and that alone maybe puts people off or makes people assume that, there's not going to be any real substance to the storytelling in here. But there is a bit more to it than that. I don't think it's fair to dismiss it just because of that style of the artwork. There is some fun stuff going on here. The main character, Sarah Pazzini, is quite a good character. She goes through some good characterization and development as this goes on. And there's other cool characters as well. And the mystery of the Witchblade that gradually unfolds, the Witchblade itself, as you go through here and learn more about it. I just thought it was entertaining. Fundamentally, it kept me wanting to read on and find out what happens next. And I've always said that that's, pretty much the best indication of whether or not a story is going to be for you or not. Do you want to find out what happens next? If the answer is yes, well, it's doing something right. We're actually going to stick with the same era, the same publisher. So like Witchblade, I've got the original Tomb Raider comics here, which were published by Top Cow, although collected in this edition here by Dark Horse a few years ago. There's actually 4 of these. I do have them all. I've covered this one on the channel before in an individual review. There's also Volume 2, Volume 3, and Volume 4. So these 4 books between them, they collect the entire, I think it was 50 issues of the first Top Cow Tomb Raider series. Like I say, I've flicked through them before. Well, I flicked through this one before, but a lot of the artwork and the storytelling is quite similar in all of them. Just take a quick look through Volume 3 here. But this is like super oversized format. It's, again, if you're a fan of Tomb Raider, the classic Tomb Raider anyway, the original PlayStation 90s era, there's some fun stuff in here. By no means like the very best comics. I think that the material in Volume 1 is probably the strongest of the lot. But it's this kind of style of artwork, very sort of 90s, and most of it's quite episodic. So it's just different stories featuring Lara Croft going off and doing her tomb raiding thing. Like I say, being a Tomb Raider fan myself, this was something that I certainly, quite liked as a supplementary addition to playing the games. And recently I've been thinking about Tomb Raider quite a bit because, as Tomb Raider fans know, if you're not a Tomb Raider fan, you probably won't know or care. But not too long ago, a couple of months ago, it was announced that they're going to be doing a remake/remastered release of the first 3 games on modern consoles. Super excited about that. Can't wait to play it. It's been a long time since I played those games. So that's going to be really cool. And it's a big deal for Tomb Raider fans who've wanted that sort of thing for a long time and didn't really think it was going to happen. In the meantime, I've been kind of flicking through these books again because, like I say, Tomb Raider's just been on my mind. But let me know if you want me to do a proper review and cover these different volumes. Like I say, I looked at Volume 1. The other volumes are, not quite as strong, but there's certainly some fun to be had with them. And I don't mind looking at them in more detail if that's something people would be interested in. They're all out of print though, there is that. And I think that these are like some of those books that go out of print and then become kind of super difficult to find later on, which is frustrating, I understand. But you never know, they might come back into print one day. I'm not actually sure what's going on with the rights to Tomb Raider comics. But let's move on then to something different. Actually, the most recent thing on here, a trade paperback collection that I've got of the Jane Foster, The Saga of the Valkyrie, which came out, this was an interesting one actually. This came out, I don't really remember now, a year or 2 ago. And I think it was originally solicited. The suggestion seemed to be it was going to be an oversized hardcover. And then it came out and turned out to be a trade paperback, which I remember at the time being kind of confused and slightly disappointed by. But this is mostly, well, a little bit of this double dips with the now newly released Thor by Jason Aaron Omnibus Volume 2, because this collects the trail end of Jane Foster's kind of time as Thor. So you get some of the issues in here at the beginning that see the conclusion of her story there. Then you move into the series that came after it. So after Jason Aaron's Thor run ended, the next thing that Jane Foster went on to do was to become a Valkyrie. How and why she becomes a Valkyrie is explained in Aaron's Thor saga. But here we just get what turned out to be a fairly short series. I think it's, was it 10 issues? Yeah, just 10 issues. But I thought this was quite fun. So this was written by, I believe, Jason Aaron and Al Ewing, if I remember correctly. It's a series that I read through at the time, and it is just quite fun. You know, it served as a little, I don't know, a little epilogue of sorts. Just gave me a little bit more of what I wanted after that story ended, and I was, you know, left wanting more, as you often are after you read something great. And to me, Jason Aaron's Thor is truly great. So whilst this wasn't as good, you know, it was good to see more of what Jane got up to following on from what she'd been through in that story. And what I will say is that this has got one of the best, in my opinion, supporting characters there's ever been in a comic. And I am very biased in saying that, but this character, the horse that she has, which calls himself just Mr. Horse. And I love this character because he is a Yorkshire horse. For those who don't know, that's an area in England. It's an area that I happen to be from, so I actually have known people in my life who talk like this horse talks, and it was a huge surprise for me. It was very hilarious when I started reading this dialogue and realised what they were doing with that character, what they were basing him on. Yeah, a lot of entertainment to be had for me personally in that reason, so that is, like I say, a biased reason to enjoy this and to enjoy that character. But above that, beyond that, this was, you know, just a fun series. It ended quite abruptly though. It was only 10 issues, like I say, so not the most substantial series and therefore probably not the most memorable. But it was something that I got a good enough amount of time reading out of that I decided to pick this collection up. Like I say, it was a bit of a shame that it was just trade paperback, and would have been cool to have it as a hardcover. You know, that's my main thing. That's the format I generally go for. But it was still pretty cool. Let's take a look at the only DC book I've got on here. This is the Justice League of America series, the run by Brad Meltzer, which came in the aftermath of the Infinite Crisis event. I have talked about this before, a couple of times actually. I've talked about it when I reviewed it individually, and it came up in my list of DC Deluxe editions, I think. Can't remember exactly what I put on all these different lists anymore, but yeah, basically this was a fun series. Quite enjoyed it. I liked what Meltzer did with creating this new iteration of the Justice League, who need to overcome some trust issues that they've all gone through as a result of Infinite Crisis and the things that led up to that in the first place. Helps that a lot of the artwork in here is by Ed Benes, who I think is a really, really great artist. It's a shame, don't seem to see him doing too much anymore. Don't really know where that guy's disappeared to. But he drew some pretty awesome stuff, not gonna lie. I'm a fan of his style. And in here it looks really great, no doubt about that, in my opinion at least. There are also covers throughout by Michael Turner, which, you know, I mentioned him already with Witchblade. Always cool to see his artwork. But this was just pretty fun, you know. I don't think there's any intention so far anyway for DC to collect any more of this series in oversized format like this, but if I remember rightly, this particular series of Justice League kind of got bogged down in different crossovers and things as it went on, so maybe that's for the best in a way. But this is the first, you know, what is it, 12 issues I think? Can't even remember. Collects the first, 12 issues of Justice League of America. And this was pretty entertaining. You know, I got a good amount of fun out of this, as I did with all these books. So it is something that I think is worth checking out if you want a relatively modern Justice League story. You know, not the best Justice League story, obviously, but I think it's worth reading. Yeah, another good book there. So we'll look at the last one I've actually piled up here, and this is back to the 90s again. This is the Guardians of the Galaxy by Jim Valentino omnibus, which maybe of all the stuff on here, I don't know actually, maybe not, but this is a book that really doesn't seem to get talked about much at all in my experience, and I'm not too sure why, because it's fun basically. You know, this is cool, maybe just because, you know, this is not the modern version of the Guardians. It's not Star-Lord, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, Groot. You know, it's the original lineup. They're much lesser known characters these days because, you know, obviously the films have made the more modern team, you know, the characters everyone thinks of when you think of the Guardians. But this is still a lot of fun. I mean, obviously don't read it if you want that other version of the team. I suppose you'll be let down in that sense. But the core concept here of this team that exists 1,000 years in the future of the Marvel Universe. These are in the 31st century, I think, around the year 3000, whatever. You know, they're way off in the distant future anyway, that's the point. But seeing them interact with, come across, and, you know, encounter things that show the legacy of the modern Marvel universe. So, you know, there's still characters who, like Galactus, you know, would still be alive in 1,000 years. Galactus, the Silver Surfer, you know, stuff like that. So there are some surviving characters from the modern day who we see in this far future and who are obviously changed because of the amount of time that's passed. But then there's other things that just show the legacy. For example, there's this entire race that calls themselves the Stark because their culture and society is based around remnants of technology that they found that had been, you know, created by Tony Stark. So we see sort of, you know, the remnants of Iron Man's legacy in the future. We see Captain America's shield still exists in the future, and that gets used. There's a descendant, I think, of Wolverine, if I remember rightly. You know, there's stuff that kind of shows that what happened in the modern era has left a long-lasting impact, and I quite liked how a lot of that was explored in here. Also, just worth saying that whilst not my favourite artist, I do like a lot of Jim Valentino's artwork in here. You know, when you talk about those 90s artists who went off and found an image together, people talk about Todd McFarlane, you know, they talk about Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld even, Will Spatasio, but nobody ever really mentions Jim Valentino in that same group, despite the fact he was one of the co-founders. I don't know if that's entirely fair because I think, you know, whilst he wasn't as high profile a creator as they were, they did more popular stuff, but still a good artist, you know? Still did some fun stuff, and this series kind of showcases that. So like I say, this was just a book that, like the others that I've talked about here, was something that I just enjoyed, and all these characters were pretty cool. But like I say, I've done a full review of this, just like I have done by, you know, have done on each of these books, so feel free to go and check it out if you want to see a bit more of it in a bit more detail, hear me talk about it. Can't remember what I said exactly in the review anymore, it was a while ago, but I'm sure I said some stuff. But anyway, thanks as always for watching. I hope that's been of some interest for anyone who wanted to see some books that maybe don't get too much coverage compared to others. You know, people talk about a lot more popular runs all the time, but some of this stuff here I don't think gets talked about too much, so I just thought I would share some thoughts on these. But like I say, I appreciate you watching as always if you stuck with me all the way through, and I'll be back in soon to discuss something else.